In this edition of Issues and Insiders, we delve into efforts to ensure the return of cultural artifacts taken from Korea in the past. So what are some of the treasures that remain far from home? What have been the gains of efforts to ensure their return? And what are the current laws against looting? Hello, you're watching Thursday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we address efforts to ensure the return of cultural artifacts that were stolen or smuggled, especially during times of past conflict. For more on this, I have Nam Ji Eun from the Cultural Heritage Restoration Foundation here in the studio. Jina, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
I also have Attorney Ahn Junseong with us.
Thank you.
Mr. Ahn, it's a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Right, Jina, let's start off then with an understanding about the size of Korea's cultural artifacts that remain overseas and yet to return home.
Right, so we have, according to the Overseas Korean Cultural Heritage Foundation, we have about 240,000 artifacts overseas. And the first country, well, the number one country with the most Korean artifacts is Japan, with over 45%. And then we have the US and Germany. But all of these numbers, they don't represent items that have yet to be returned because some of them have been gifted or they've been legally acquired. So they're not all appropriate for restitution. But a lot of them, of course, have a lot of research that needs to be done regarding their provenance. So the majority of them might still have to be considered for repatriation, but yeah, so far we have over 240,000 items.
And most of the items that we're seeking to have returned to the country are those perhaps that have been looted or the ones that have also been legally acquired?
So for restitution, the basis has to be either illegal trafficking or smuggling or looting, and that can be during wartime or it can be done by individuals. So in Korea's case, the reason that Japan has so many is because there have been a lot of conflicts between Korea and Japan, in which case a lot of Korean artifacts have made their way to Japan. And the number actually continues to increase every year because the more we do investigative research, the more we find out. And a lot of institutions have artifacts around the world as well too, but a lot of private individuals, as they pass away, their collections are starting to come to the surface. So the number of artifacts that are overseas continues to rise.
Right, I see. And Ms. Ahn, before we advance any further, do give us some legal perspective on the matter. What can you tell us about the laws against looting?
Yes, well, there's an international law on point, actually. It's called the 1970 UNESCO Convention on Cultural Property. And, you know, I think it's significant because that it is the first multilateral international agreement to fight against looting. Means that multilateral means that more than two, basically, you know, over 100 countries have signed it. So it's very important, significant international development. However, there are some other limitations and some challenges. But it was adopted in 1970, and which came in force in 1972. Why do I mention about 1972? That the application only, the convention only apply anything trafficking happened after 1972. So there's there's some debate on issues that it's really effective because a lot of things happened actually before 1970, the effective year of the convention.
Right, I see. Jina, I understand you were part of a campaign that saw the restitution of philosopher and politician, of course, Song Si-yeol's work, Songja, daejeon. Could you walk us slowly through that particular endeavor?
Yes. So last year, I was able to recover over 12 wooden printing blocks, and they were in Japan and Korea. And one of them happened to be teacher Song Si-yeol's wooden printing block. And that's what the Songja daejeon book is. And so we found a wooden printing block copy. So there's over 11,000 teacher Song Si-yeol's wooden printing blocks from what we understand. And so I was able to recover one of them from the States. And right now we're doing a lot more research to understand the contents of it because it's in Chinese characters. And accordingly, we might use it to conduct more education to the youth, or we might repatriate it to the appropriate location.
So getting this artwork back within a year then, was it? Or did it take longer, the negotiations? I wonder how long the discussions took.
The negotiations didn't take as long because we had to conduct it online, and the conclusion was reached quite quickly. And so we were able to negotiate that aspect really fast. However, bringing it back to Korea took a while because we had to go and get it, but we were overseas a lot too. And so we had to find a way to get to America and then bring it back.
So relatively, that was a fast procedure then?
Yes.
Relatively speaking.
1 year is quite fast.
Right, and that being said, I asked because, Mr. Ahn, there were similar restitution efforts by Korea's Cultural Heritage Administration that took 15 years of negotiations with Boston's Museum of Fine Arts. Could you tell us a bit about that endeavor, the details, the results, as well as I understand there's some remaining issues of conflict there?
Yeah, that's a very interesting negotiation case, actually. It took 15 years. Actually, in terms of the cultural property negotiation, it takes more than a decade, very common, so also many times. But it is very successful. I think, in a way, from my perspective, I think very successful negotiation. A lot of details were two parts. First part is that the sarayna, so in Korean sari, the remain of the the Korean Buddhist bank, or not only there's some Indian Buddhist monks, right? And the other part is the saraya container, called sariham in Korean. So basically what happened was that there was a 15 years negotiation. Boston Museum have decided to donate the saraya, the sari, to the Korean temple. And prior to the Buddha's birthday this year, which is for on the May 15th, and however they decided not to donate the the sariham, the container, the saraya container, to the Korean temple. And there are some issues that I think the one of the argument they made by the Boston Museum is that when they took the position of that the cultural property it was the legal way. It's not illegal. That's one of the argument. But if we actually see the 1978 UNESCO Convention, actually the title of the UNESCO Convention actually used the term illicit, not illegal. There's difference from legal perspective. When you say illegal means prohibited by law, illicit, well, it's not really legal. You don't use it often in the legal term, but illicit means that something socially prohibited, something go against the social norms or the values, right? Something is much broader than actually legal, the frameworks. So in a way, I think that Boston, Museum didn't really consider about what's the point of UNESCO Convention, because the UNESCO Convention actually talk about illicit transfer of the stolen. And they know that actually the Boston Museum knew that it's come from the Korean temple. That's what they're saying actually. So I guess that's the one and good. Also, I think that also that saraya used to have the religious value. I mean, spiritual value. It's something. It's not about. It's different from something. You talk about Songja or something. It's something spiritual meaning value to it. So I think they should have returned earlier. And the other thing is that, and there's a further negotiation. The issue about the loan agreement, because that in a way happened was that they decided not to give the ownership of the sari container, and they say we provide on the loan basis. And they, according to the press, they have not decided specific terms of their arrangement, but still they're going to do it. But there was some some debate on is it correct? I mean, is it best way to return it on the loan basis? From my perspective, I think it's better than nothing actually. But something something illegally took out of country, coming back centuries later, 2 centuries later, it doesn't really matter how form, and as long as we get a physical ownership on it, we can get it. I think that's the good enough.
Right, especially because this particular relic, I understand, dates back to the 14th century.
Yeah.
Right, Mr. Ahn, do you suppose then art restitution in the form of loans, as you mentioned earlier, is perhaps the first step in the right direction to ultimately ensure their complete return to the country?
That's a very interesting question, because I have myself the same question, because I used to teach that actually the Joseon dynasty's manuscript, the return negotiation, which took 18 years, and they're struggling. And I actually talked to the NGO, the Cultural Action. I called them actually. I was wondering about what's going on, and there was a public debate on should we get it at a loan basis or should we fight for the complete return, complete ownership return. And I asked them, the director of the NGO, say, is it better we getting back physically, at least better than nothing, and fighting another decade? I think what's the point, right? And he said, like, well, I think you're right, And then later I found out that a few weeks later they decided to go for the, the loan basis, because you have to look at the reality of the international politics, that can you really take it? We lost it because of some reason, because the war, any reason is gone, right? We take it back, it's not easy. If we want to get legal ownership of it, that's a very different issue. About the manuscript case, the Joseon Dynasty, the problem was that the French government registered the part of National Archive. They categorized as the national treasure, or French national treasure. So what happened was that even if the Sarkozy, then President Sarkozy, tried to return their ownership to the Korean government, they have the problem with the legal issue because that it's illegal to take it out or transfer ownership to another country. So they end up with loan agreement. So keeping legal ownership in a French National Library and giving back to the physical ownership on 5-year loan basis with automatic renewal. But actually, if you're looking at the agreement, they say French government can object to renewal technically, but then do not take that action. That's the issue. How in practicality issue, right?
Right, I see. Moving forward, Jina, do you suppose the recent global popularity of a K-entertainment, including, of course, K-music, K-movies, as well as its dramas, has it perhaps renewed greater interest in K-cultural artifacts?
I definitely think so. I think that thanks to the K-wave, a lot of people around the world are showing interest in Korea. I think the Korean government has done a lot of effort, and the Korean people, and we can't ignore what the Korean diaspora population has done for many, many years. You know, they were civilian ambassadors for Korea, so all of these efforts have accumulated to this greater awareness and interest in Korea, and I think that naturally goes further. I think they want to know more about modern Korea, and they want to understand how Korea came to be, why Korea is the way it is, and more about history. And what they want to know is the difference between Korea and China and Japan. Because what happens in a lot of the museums abroad that I've seen personally is a lot of Korean artifacts have been mislabeled as Japanese or Chinese. So even the wooden printing blocks that I found was listed as Chinese wooden printing blocks. But I asked some of our scholars, and they recognized that these were by Korean scholars. And so in such cases, there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lack of clarity, and we still have a lot of curators that need to be developed and sent overseas and taught about Korean history and how to properly display them or preserve them. And so there is a lot of interest, but there's still so much that needs to be done. And in terms of repatriation, since 1945, our liberation, we've had 11,000 returned, and there's still so much more that needs to be done. And so I think with all the interest that's been garnering, Korea is definitely, has a lot of work to do. She has a lot of work to do in terms of packaging and helping other people understand what Korean history is, why our culture is so celebrated in Korea. And I think Korea can continue to take steps forward, not only by talking about the artifacts that she wants to find again, well, that Korea wants to find again, but to help other countries to locate theirs. Because artifact repatriation is an issue that a lot of other countries in the world are dealing with.
Right, and I understand also that there is a growing number of activists who are actually leading the global push for to recover these looted artifacts. How do you explain this relatively recent phenomenon?
Yeah, I think cultural artifact repatriation, it's getting a lot of attention nowadays all around the world, because in the past, looting was the norm. You know, spoils, taking spoils after war, and the stronger cultural power or the country would take over other countries. But I think nowadays, a lot of people are realizing that their identity comes from their history and their cultural heritage. And the reason that we call it cultural heritage, even the Korean law is being passed where we don't say cultural property, but we say cultural heritage now, because we understand the necessity of passing this on to future generations and also celebrating it together. And I think people understand that that's where their identity comes from. They want to have their voice heard on the international stage. They want to make sure that their narrative and their perspective is shown as well, history in its original and appropriate context. And that's why we have restoration movements. And I think it's a great thing to see ordinary civilians really rise up and go online and make polls or discussions and demand repatriation and have these efforts as well. And in our foundation's case, we also represent 1,600 ordinary Korean civilians. So we have the government's role and I think the civilians' role. And whenever we go overseas and we tell them we represent 1,600 people who have signed up with us, they're really moved because they understand that it seems like cultural heritage is something that the government should take care of. And although the government does represent the people, we have ordinary citizens who don't want their cultural heritage to be swayed by politics sometimes. And like we said, negotiations take a long time, and it's even more so when we have bureaucracy involved and politics involved. But sometimes we have the overseas Korean diaspora who are able to locate these artifacts, purchase it with their own money, and donate it back to Korea. And so I think a lot of these ordinary or average movements is a beautiful thing to see. And I think we're going to continue to see how much it impacts the restitution movement.
Right, and keeping in mind what Jina has just said, Ms. Tan, speaking within your capacity as, of course, a former college professor, what efforts can be made on the diplomatic front to perhaps better support efforts by the civilians to have our cultural heritage returned?
Well, actually, if you see the 1970 UNESCO Convention, actually, the way you process it, you have to use the diplomatic channel, actually, when you're using it. The problem was that there's so much limitation on using the UNESCO Convention. That's the problem. So going back to that, the French negotiation, that when it was the cultural action, the NGO actually brought action, legal action in Paris court, actually. They sued the National Library of France, actually, to get returned the ownership of the national treasure, basically. So very interesting because they act very active. I think that there's coordination, need to get coordination between public and private sector. Not only that, it takes really long time, at least a decade if you're big ones. So litigation, sometimes litigation. So you have to be very persistent. And then also, I think that doing the research, you find that one of the things you have to do it on the more return of the future is that you need to get more research on what we have, why we don't have it. And for use the UNESCO Convention, you need to have to show documentation requirements so that certain cultural property is documented to the inventory of some certain institution, basically. So you have to get more research in Korea, actually, to find out why we have it, what kind of things we can prove it, right? And also that, in a way, you can do it in the overseas. If going back to that, French case, right? Actually, the French librarian, Dr. Lee Byung-sun, actually, she found it by herself. Actually, before she found that the manuscript, it categorized as a Chinese book, because it was written in Chinese. So nobody knew, in France, nobody knew it was a Korean manuscript. So she found it because she was Korean, right? So, and it took her like almost 20 years to get it back. Yeah, so I guess the more research side is very significant. Also that public awareness, in terms of the Japan situation, since that there's more than 40% of the cultural property is, in Japan. If you look at the UNESCO Convention, actually, the Japan signed the convention 2002. So it means that the both countries, when the convention become effective after both countries become the signatory to the convention. So anything before 2002, actually, UNESCO Convention does not apply. That's the limitation. So there's a lot of things, international application issues, and public awareness also. Yeah, I think that's the issues you have to do, and the further research on the, historic research on the documentation.
Right, knowing what is out there, as Jina had mentioned earlier. Jina, is there a Korean cultural artifact that you would personally like to see returned in the near future?
I think there's so many, and I think the list would go on, especially the more we find out. But currently, I have two in mind, actually. The first one is called Baekje's Smile. So it's actually a Buddhist statue that was found in Puyo, where the Baekje Kingdom used to be, and it was taken to Japan. And right now, a private individual currently owns it. And so we know some people and our, members of our foundation have been a part of that negotiation process for over 10 years now. And so in the case before, taking 1 year is a really fast process, and even 10, it takes a long time to have these things recovered. So that's the first case. The smile of the Buddhist statue is so beautiful, that's why we call it Baekje's Smile, right? The second one is also in Japan, actually. It's the Ogura collection. And that Ogura collection was taken, I forgot the exact date, actually, but there's so many dates that we have to remember. But when the Ogura collection was taken, when Korea and Japan signed an agreement in 1965, they said that the national inventory in Japan, so those would be under research and those would be liable for restitution perhaps, but private individuals the Japanese government couldn't touch. But the Ogura collection went over to the Tokyo National Museum. And so when it went over into the national holding, Korea was supposed to be alerted, and they were supposed to be told, listen, we have this private individual's collection that's coming into our collection now. Would you like to conduct research and perhaps talk about repatriation efforts? But from our research so far, from all diplomatic channels and any paperwork, Korea was not notified. And so that is something that we have to look at legally as well, whether they did breach that agreement and if it is a demand for restitution.
Right, and keeping in mind what Jina has just said, then Mr. Ahn, is there a way to facilitate collaboration between private and public parties, legally that is, in efforts to recover looted artwork?
It's a very interesting question, actually. The UNESCO Convention is very limited application. So actually, it's supposed to make do transaction between the art dealer and museums, most likely, but do not regulate the museum, only the art dealers, something they're selling illegally or something, stolen property. And so basically the museum is, they have like free will, whatever they want to do. It's just what happened to Boston Museum. They say, oh, you don't want to give it, so they can keep it for a long time, right? So for Japan's case, like many individuals have it, but that's quite different story because that if it's a national collection, just like Joseon Dynasty, the manuscript, there's other legal implications, right? How government, basically G2G, right? Government bilateral relations. But if it's a private sector, private individual, that's a really different issue. That I think that should be, if they push it too much, they don't like it much because the individuals, right? Maybe the NGOs or some other organizations have to do it, not the government, because government may be too much, to them too much pressure because they know they took it illegally, even though they have legal ownership at this time, but this moment, but they know it was illegally stolen from that, Korea, and they don't want to talk to it. I remember that during the Obama administration, they returned the national seal of the Joseon Dynasty, 5 seals. I remember the one thing that happened was that it's not them. I think U.S. Marine took it from ditch of the Doksu Palace.
Right.
And he claimed that, oh, I took it from, that was in the ditch. Right. And then it was very interesting, though, how it happened was the U.S. government found out, right? And that there was illegally took it. And then there was the actual lieutenant was passed away. Their family member found that there's something here very valuable, very valuable, but they're not sure what it is. And they had some issue. I think they have tax issue, some legal issue of government. So government had to deal with their family that if you give back to the national treasure, to us, we'll deal with your legal issues. So some issues happen. So you have to be
It's a very daunting task to get
so it's a lot of coordinations, and then the other government side, like U.S. government, something like that, but they did it. They have to really willing to do, cooperate. That's very important.
Which is why I said it's a very difficult task, and we are so happy that people like Jina are trying to work very hard to get our artwork back then. All right, Jina, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Mr. Ahn, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching, and do join us again same time tomorrow.